There's a difference between clearing a name and answering questions. At first glance, those two things sound identical. Most people use them interchangeably. If someone believes they have been wrongly accused, naturally they want their name cleared. If someone feels the public misunderstood their actions, naturally they want the record corrected. But the Whittaker story has reached a point where those two goals no longer necessarily move together. Because over the past year, something unusual has happened. The conversation stopped being about what people thought was going to happen and started becoming about what actually happened. The house was never built. The family was separated. The investigations began. The fundraising became controversial. The videos disappeared. The accusations multiplied. And now, after months of silence, Eric Carroll has returned to publicly defend himself. The problem is that every answer he provides seems to create another question. That does not automatically mean he is wrong. It does not automatically mean he is guilty. It does not automatically mean every criticism aimed at him is justified. But it does mean something important. The public story remains unresolved. And unresolved stories create pressure. That pressure is what we are seeing now. Because Eric's recent appearances have focused heavily on one theme. His belief that people misunderstood his role. His belief that he became the target of narratives that ignored what he actually did. His belief that he was trying to help a vulnerable family and ended up being blamed for outcomes that were larger than any one person could control. That is the version of events Eric appears to be presenting. But there is another side to the conversation. Not necessarily an opposing side. A questioning side. A side asking whether intentions and outcomes should be evaluated separately. Because even if someone genuinely intended to help, people still want answers about results. And results are much harder to explain away. Take the house project. For months, viewers watched discussions about housing solutions. People donated money. People shared content. People followed updates. The expectation was simple. At some point, the Whittaker family would end up in significantly improved living conditions. That was the practical goal. Not internet fame. Not online arguments. Not creator disputes. A better place for the family to live. Yet somehow, despite all the attention, all the fundraising, all the planning, and all the promises, that outcome never fully materialized. Instead, the family became more fragmented than before. That reality sits at the center of nearly every question people still ask. Because when people look back at the timeline, they see tremendous activity. Trips, meetings, fundraisers, court appearances, protective orders, APS involvement, social media campaigns, public statements, private messages, content creation, but they struggle to identify a result proportional to all that activity. And when that happens, people begin asking uncomfortable questions, not necessarily because they believe wrongdoing occurred, but because they want to understand how so much effort produced such a complicated ending. This is where Eric's current position becomes difficult, because he is attempting to explain his intentions after people have already seen the outcome. And outcomes influence perception. A lot. Imagine two different versions of the same story. In one version, a family receives a new home, improved care, stable resources, and remains together. In another version, the family becomes divided, investigations emerge, legal disputes develop, and public trust collapses. The exact same actions can look very different depending on which ending occurs. That is the challenge Eric now faces. People are evaluating the past through the lens of the present. And the present is messy. One of the most controversial elements involves accountability. Who should be held responsible for what happened? That sounds like a straightforward question. It is not. Because the Whittaker story involved multiple actors, family members, content creators, donors, viewers, government agencies, advocates, critics. Everyone played some role. But not every role carried equal responsibility. And that distinction matters. Many people now focus on Patrick. Others focus on Eric. Some focus on Betty. Others blame APS. Some blame the internet itself. The reality is probably more complicated than any single explanation. But complexity is frustrating. People want clarity. They want names. They want answers. They want cause and effect. Who caused what? Who benefited? Who failed? Who should have acted differently? These questions continue because nobody has provided answers that satisfy everyone. Eric's recent efforts appear aimed at addressing that gap. He wants people to understand what he says he actually did. He wants people to understand the resources he invested, the time he spent, the travel, the meetings, the paperwork, the involvement, the emotional commitment. And there is no question that he invested significant time into the situation. Even critics generally acknowledge that. The debate is not whether he was involved. The debate is what that involvement ultimately accomplished. Because effort alone does not resolve controversy. Results do. And this is where the conversation becomes increasingly uncomfortable. Particularly when money enters the picture. Money changes everything. It always has. The moment donations begin flowing into any public story, expectations change. People stop thinking like viewers. They start thinking like stakeholders. They want transparency, documentation, accountability, clear explanations. Where did funds go? How were they spent? Who authorized decisions? What was donated? What was purchased? What was promised? What was delivered? These are not unreasonable questions. In fact, they are exactly the questions people should ask whenever vulnerable individuals become connected to public fundraising. Because transparency protects everyone. It protects donors. It protects beneficiaries. And it protects organizers. When transparency exists, misunderstandings become easier to resolve. When transparency is absent, suspicion grows. And suspicion is difficult to eliminate once it takes hold. That is part of the reason the current debate remains so intense. Many people feel they still do not have a complete picture, not because they necessarily believe the worst, but because gaps remain, and gaps invite speculation. Another issue that continues resurfacing involves Eric's relationship with APS. This topic has become particularly significant because Eric now appears deeply frustrated with how that part of the story unfolded. From his perspective, APS may represent the moment where his efforts began being interpreted differently. He has suggested that his actions were motivated by concern, that he contacted agencies because he believed help was needed, that he was responding to circumstances he found troubling. But critics see the situation differently. They argue that involvement from protective agencies ultimately accelerated the chain of events that separated the family. Again, these perspectives are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Both can contain elements of truth. A person can genuinely believe they are helping while consequences unfold in ways they never intended. History is full of examples like that. Good intentions do not guarantee good outcomes, and bad outcomes do not automatically prove bad intentions. The Whittaker story seems trapped inside that tension, which brings us back to the central question. Why is Eric working so hard to clear his name now? Because names matter, reputations matter, public narratives matter, especially when those narratives become attached to investigations, vulnerable people, and years of online scrutiny. Eric appears to believe that history is being written without his side fully represented, that people have drawn conclusions before hearing everything he knows. And perhaps there is some truth to that. But there's also another truth. People are not only asking about Eric anymore. They are asking about the entire system that surrounded the Whittakers. The fundraising, the content, the promises, the oversight, the accountability, the intervention, the outcome. And until those questions receive answers that feel complete, the discussion is unlikely to dissipate, because the issue is no longer simply whether Eric's name should be cleared. The issue is whether the public finally understands what actually happened. And right now, those are still two very different questions. Comment below. Do you think clearing a person's name requires proving good intentions, proving good results, or both? The deeper Eric tries to explain the story, the more the conversation moves away from individual moments and toward a larger question. What was the actual mission? That sounds simple. Help the Whittaker family. But when people look back at everything that happened, they often realize that different people seem to have very different definitions of what helping actually meant. For some viewers, helping meant immediate improvements. A cleaner house, better food, medical care, reliable transportation, safe living conditions. For others, helping meant long-term change, legal protections, financial stability, permanent housing, structured support systems. And for still others, helping meant something much less tangible. Visibility, attention, awareness, giving a forgotten family a voice. The problem is that these goals do not always move together. Sometimes they even conflict. A family can receive attention without receiving stability. A family can receive donations without receiving structure. A family can receive sympathy without receiving protection. And that appears to be one of the central tensions surrounding the Whittaker story. Because by the time millions of people knew who the family was, very few people seemed to agree on what the ultimate objective had become. That confusion matters, because when objectives become unclear, accountability becomes unclear too. Imagine two people working on the same project. One believes the goal is raising awareness. The other believes the goal is building a permanent solution. Both can honestly believe they are helping, yet both can judge the outcome completely differently. One may say the project succeeded. The other may say it failed. The Whittaker situation increasingly resembles that kind of disagreement, especially when discussing the period before everything began falling apart. Because there was a time when optimism existed. People forget that now. Looking backward, it is easy to focus on investigations, disputes, accusations, and family separation. But earlier in the story, many viewers genuinely believed positive change was happening. New experiences, new opportunities, medical appointments, public support, financial assistance. For a while, the story looked hopeful. That is important to remember because it helps explain why disappointment became so intense later. People do not become angry when they expect failure. They become angry when they expected success. The stronger the expectation, the stronger the disappointment. And expectations surrounding the Whittakers became enormous. Some people believe they were watching a family receive a second chance. Others believe they were watching a rescue. Others believe they were watching a transformation. Then reality intervened. And reality proved far more complicated than the internet wanted it to be. One issue that keeps resurfacing is the difference between involvement and authority. This distinction is often overlooked. Many viewers assume that the people most visible in a situation must also be the people most responsible for every outcome. That is not always true. Visibility and authority are not the same thing. A person can appear central to a story while possessing very limited actual power. Likewise, someone with significant influence can remain almost completely invisible to the public. Eric appears to be arguing that people dramatically overestimated his authority, that they assumed he controlled things he never controlled, that they attributed decisions to him that were ultimately made by others. Whether viewers accept that argument is another matter, but it is clearly becoming one of the central themes of his defense. He wants people to distinguish between participation and control, between involvement and ownership, between influence and authority, because once those distinctions blur, responsibility becomes difficult to assign accurately. And nowhere is that more obvious than when discussing the family's eventual separation. This remains one of the most emotionally charged aspects of the entire story. 3 family members removed, others left behind, communication disrupted, relationships fractured, years of shared life suddenly interrupted. For many observers, everything else becomes secondary compared to that outcome. Regardless of intentions, regardless of explanations, regardless of legal processes, people look at the ending and see loss. And when people see loss, they naturally search for causes. Who caused this? Who could have prevented it? Who made the crucial decisions? These questions continue because the answers remain incomplete. Eric's position seems to be that the state ultimately made those decisions, that agencies evaluated the circumstances and acted independently. Critics often respond that outside involvement helped create the conditions that led to those decisions. Again, these positions are not necessarily contradictory. Multiple factors can contribute to the same outcome. That is often how complicated situations unfold. There is rarely a single turning point. Usually there are dozens. Small decisions, small misunderstandings, small escalations, each one insignificant alone, collectively transformative. The Whittaker story appears filled with those moments. A phone call, a court appearance, a donation, a disagreement, a report, a meeting, a video, a rumor, a misunderstanding, none necessarily decisive on their own. Yet together they created consequences nobody initially expected. That complexity creates another challenge. People increasingly want a villain, a single person, a simple explanation, someone who can absorb all responsibility, someone who can make the story easier to understand. But real life rarely cooperates with that desire, especially in situations involving vulnerable families. Because vulnerable families often exist within vulnerable systems. Limited resources, limited oversight, limited support, limited options. Those conditions existed long before the internet discovered the Whittakers. That fact is easy to forget. Before the videos, before the donations, before the creators, before the controversy, the family already faced enormous challenges. Those challenges did not suddenly appear because cameras arrived. The cameras simply made them visible. Visibility changed everything. Not because visibility itself is inherently harmful, but because visibility attracts people. Helpers, critics, supporters, opportunists, advocates, content creators, investigators, donors. Everyone arrives with different motives. Some admirable, some questionable, most probably somewhere in between. And once enough people enter a story, control becomes almost impossible. That may be one reason Eric now seems focused on defending the past. Because once a narrative becomes public property, nobody controls it anymore. Not the family, not the creators, not the critics, not even the people at the center of it. The narrative develops its own momentum. Pieces get repeated. Details get exaggerated. Assumptions become facts. Facts become disputed. And eventually everyone starts arguing about different versions of the same story. That is where the Whittaker conversation seems to be today. Not one story. Several competing stories. One story says people genuinely tried to help and were blamed for outcomes beyond their control. Another says vulnerable people were exploited under the appearance of helping. Another says the real failures existed inside institutions that should have intervened years earlier. Another says the entire situation reflects what happens when internet attention collides with extreme vulnerability. All of these narratives contain supporters. All contain critics. None fully explains everything. And that is why the debate continues. Because everyone can point to evidence supporting part of their argument. Yet nobody seems capable of explaining the entire picture. Perhaps that is why Eric's recent appearances have generated so much discussion. Not because he answered every question, but because he reopened questions many people assumed would never be addressed. Questions about APS, questions about fundraising, questions about guardianship, questions about responsibility, questions about intentions, questions about what really happened behind the scenes. The irony is that his effort to provide clarity may actually reveal how complicated the story always was. Because the more details emerge, the harder it becomes to maintain simple conclusions. Heroes become complicated. Villains become complicated. Motives become complicated. Outcomes become complicated. And somewhere in the middle of all that complexity remains the reality that often gets overlooked. The Whittakers themselves. A family that became famous without asking for fame. A family whose struggles became public property. A family discussed by millions of strangers. A family still living with consequences long after most viewers moved on. That reality matters. Because regardless of where anyone stands on Eric, Patrick, APS, fundraising, or investigations, the human cost remains the same. The people at the center of the story continue living with outcomes that cannot simply be edited away, deleted, or explained through live streams. Which is why one question still hangs over everything. Not whether Eric clears his name. Not whether critics change their minds. Not whether investigations end. But whether the people whose lives started this entire story are actually better off today than they were before the world found them. And depending on how someone answers that question, they may also answer every other question surrounding this case. Comment below. Looking at the entire Whittaker story from beginning to end, do you believe the family ended up better off, worse off, or somewhere in between after all the attention they received? There's a final layer to this story that rarely gets discussed because it is harder to measure than money, harder to document than court records, and harder to argue about than investigations. It is trust, and once trust breaks, almost every fact becomes contested. That may be the clearest way to understand why the Whittaker story remains active long after so many of the original events occurred. People are no longer debating only what happened. They are debating who they believe. And those are two very different conversations. Because if trust remains intact, explanations often satisfy people. When trust disappears, explanations become evidence of something else. Every statement gets questioned. Every timeline gets challenged. Every missing detail becomes suspicious. Every contradiction becomes significant. That is the environment Eric has returned to. Not a neutral audience waiting for information. An audience already divided. Some people believe he has been unfairly blamed. Others believe he has never answered the most important questions. And between those groups sits a much larger audience that simply does not know what to believe anymore. That uncertainty is what gives this story its staying power. Because certainty has become surprisingly rare. Take something as simple as motive. Most public debates eventually settle around motive. People decide why someone acted. Then they build the rest of the story around that conclusion. But motive remains one of the least provable parts of any situation, especially one this complicated. Did Eric become involved because he genuinely wanted to help? He says yes. Many people who support him believe that completely. Did he also benefit from the attention surrounding the Whittakers? Critics would argue yes. Can both things be true simultaneously? Absolutely. That possibility is what makes the conversation so difficult. Because the internet prefers opposites. Hero or villain. Helper or exploiter. Truthful or dishonest. But human behavior rarely operates in those categories. Most real situations exist somewhere in the uncomfortable middle. A place where good intentions and bad decisions can coexist. A place where people can help and harm simultaneously without fully realizing either. A place where outcomes become more important than motives because motives alone cannot change what happened. And what happened is impossible to ignore. The Whittaker family became one of the most recognized families on the internet. Millions watched them. Thousands discussed them. Countless people donated money, offered support, shared videos, and followed updates. Yet despite all of that attention, the ending remains remarkably uncertain. That uncertainty fuels everything. Because when people look at the story today, they do not see closure. They see loose ends. Questions about finances. Questions about investigations. Questions about accountability. Questions about family separation. Questions about future contact. Questions about promises that were made and promises that were never fulfilled. The more unresolved questions remain, the longer the story survives. That is why attempts to clear a name often become complicated. People assume clearing a name is about proving innocence. Sometimes it is, but often it is about restoring confidence. And confidence is much harder to restore than innocence, because confidence depends on perception, and perception is shaped by experience. Many viewers spent years watching this story unfold. They watched videos. They watched live streams. They watched interviews. They watched disputes. They watched public disagreements between people who once appeared aligned. That accumulated experience forms impressions. Those impressions become difficult to change, not because people are stubborn, because they remember, and memory is powerful. When Eric says he wants his name cleared, he is not simply challenging accusations. He is challenging memories. He is asking people to reinterpret events they already witnessed. That is always difficult, especially when those events produced consequences nobody can reverse. The family cannot simply return to the exact position they occupied before. The internet cannot unknow what it learned. The investigations cannot unhappen. The controversy cannot dissipate. History moves in one direction, forward, which means every explanation offered today must compete against outcomes that already exist. That challenge becomes even greater when discussing responsibility. One of the most common questions people ask is surprisingly simple. If everyone was trying to help, why did things end this way? It is an uncomfortable question because it does not target one person. It targets the entire situation. And there is no easy answer. Maybe too many people became involved. Maybe not enough qualified people became involved. Maybe systems failed. Maybe individuals failed. Maybe both. Maybe the internet amplified problems faster than solutions could keep pace. Maybe vulnerable people became trapped inside circumstances no single person could fully control. Whatever explanation someone chooses, one reality remains impossible to avoid. The outcome fell far short of what many people originally hoped for. That disappointment continues shaping every discussion, including discussions about Eric. Because public trust often follows a simple equation. People are willing to overlook mistakes when outcomes improve. They become far less forgiving when outcomes deteriorate. That principle applies everywhere. Business, politics, charity, public service, online advocacy. Results matter. And when results become controversial, scrutiny follows. That scrutiny is what Eric now faces. Not necessarily because everyone believes he acted improperly, but because people are still trying to understand what role he played in a story that ended very differently than expected. There's another reason the discussion refuses to dissipate. The story touches larger concerns beyond the Whittakers themselves. Questions about vulnerable adults. Questions about online fundraising. Questions about content creation involving disabled individuals. Questions about oversight. Questions about responsibility. Questions about what happens when internet attention becomes intertwined with real human lives. These issues extend far beyond one family. That is why so many people continue paying attention. The Whittaker story became a case study, not just a family story, a cautionary story, one that forces people to ask difficult questions. Who should protect vulnerable people? Who should oversee donations? Who should make decisions when competing interests emerge? What safeguards should exist before large audiences become involved? And perhaps most importantly, what happens when nobody clearly owns responsibility? That final question may be the most important of all, because throughout this entire saga, responsibility often seemed scattered. One person blamed another, another pointed elsewhere. Agencies made decisions. Families made decisions. Creators made decisions. Viewers made judgments. Yet when responsibility spreads everywhere, it can sometimes feel like responsibility exists nowhere. That is the danger. Not one villain escaping accountability. A system where accountability becomes impossible to locate. Eric appears to believe his role has been exaggerated. Critics believe it has been minimized. The truth may ultimately exist somewhere between those positions. But until more definitive answers emerge, the debate will continue. Because unresolved stories create their own momentum. People keep searching, keep questioning, keep revisiting timelines, keep examining old videos, keep comparing statements, keep looking for the missing piece that will finally make everything fit together. Maybe that piece exists. Maybe it does not. Maybe the uncomfortable reality is that some stories never provide complete answers. Not because someone is hiding them, because reality itself is messy, contradictory, incomplete, difficult. The Whittaker story may ultimately belong in that category. A story where multiple people can sincerely believe different versions of events. A story where intentions, actions, and outcomes refuse to align neatly. A story where certainty remains elusive. And that brings us back to Eric. His recent appearances suggest he believes history is still being written, that the final chapter has not been completed, that the public record remains incomplete, that people have judged before hearing everything. Perhaps he is right. Perhaps there are still details waiting to emerge. Perhaps future investigations, documents, statements, or disclosures will change how people understand the story. Or perhaps public opinion has already hardened beyond repair. Time will answer that question. But for now, one reality remains undeniable. Eric wants his name cleared. His critics want answers. And until those two goals intersect, the Whittaker story will remain exactly where it has been for months. Not resolved, not forgotten, not finished. Just waiting for the next piece of information that might finally explain how a family that captured the attention of millions ended up at the center of one of the internet's most complicated and controversial stories. Comment below. Do you think the Whittaker story is ultimately a story about individual accountability, or a story about a system that failed everyone involved?